I mean, as a Christian, I already had a conflict with this because I view this as lying to that child. If a
Right.
child's confused about these things, I can, I'm compassionate about that. I understand confusion is normal, but to knowingly lie, that's not compassionate or loving. And as a Christian, I'm not going to do that. So already there's a conflict between what my employer is asking me to do and what my God is asking me to do.
Hey everyone, this is Yvette Hampton. Welcome back to the Schoolhouse Rocked Podcast. I am so glad you are with me this week. We have a new guest on, and you guys are going to be so encouraged. You know, on the Schoolhouse Rocked Podcast, we talk about everything homeschooling. I was thinking about this morning, and I thought it's so interesting the people that God brings to us, because we talk about everything. We talk about like how to homeschool, and we talk about all the different methods of homeschooling, and we talk about questions and answers that you guys have with homeschooling and all the different things that encompass home education and family discipleship. But one of the things I love to talk about is kind of what's going on outside of homeschooling. And so we have a guest on today. His name is John Stamper, and he was a public school teacher for 13 years. He's been in the system. He actually went to public school for the second half of his schooling career when he was a kid, but he was also homeschooled. And so he has a really unique perspective on public schools and what's going on in the public school system. He's a coach and he is an author. He's the author of this book. It's called Conflicted: Pulling Back the Curtain on Public Education. So we're going to talk about that this week. We're going to talk about what's going on in the public school system. And I love that we get to talk about these things because it's real. It's I think one of those things that reminds us why we're doing what we're doing. And when we get that little itch to maybe put our kids back in public school and say, oh, it's going to be okay. We're having a hard time with homeschooling. We want to give you these reminders of, okay, this is what's actually going on in the public school system. And so I'm glad that you're with us this week. It's going to be a great conversation. But before we get started, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, CTC Math. If you guys are looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com. Try them out for free, ctcmath.com. Well, John, welcome to the Schoolhouse Rocked Podcast. I'm so glad to get to meet you, and we've had fun chatting. Before we get started, introduce yourself to our audience and just tell us who you are and a little bit of your background.
Sure. Hi, it's nice to meet you as well. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everybody. I am John Stamper. I'm from Indiana. I was a public school and private school teacher for 13 years. 11 of those years were public schools. Um, I've taught multiple grade levels, multiple subject areas. Um, I currently am creating homeschool courses through Masterbooks, the Masterbooks Academy. They're a Christian homeschool curriculum provider. I also wrote this book, and I host a podcast called The State of State Schools, where I kind of give a weekly recap on what's happening in schools. But as Yvette mentioned, I was homeschooled the first half of my childhood, my childhood education. Went to public school, was a public school teacher, private school teacher, and now am back working in the homeschool field. So it's kind of gone like full circle. I've had a wide variety of experiences over my career. So hopefully something that we talk about today resonates with you out there and you guys can relate to it and you leave encouraged.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your childhood with being homeschooled, because you said your mom started homeschooling you
Yeah.
early on. What Give us kind of a background on that.
Sure. So this is a bit of a story, so feel free to ask a question if I go on too long. But so we grew up in small town Indiana, a rural community, farming community. I'm the youngest of four. So right around 1990 is when all this started to happen. I was about 4 or 5 years old. My older siblings were enrolled in the local public schools at the time. And our local public school system had a tradition of allowing outside community groups like 4-H, Girl Scouts, the Gideons to come into schools once a year and kind of talk to students to let them know what's out there. So the Gideons had a tradition for decades where they would go to the fifth grade classrooms and talk about what the Gideons do. We distribute Bibles to hotels, etc. And if anyone wanted a Bible, they would give them a Bible. And this had been happening, and the school board wanted this to happen. But a parent in the community sued the school board over the Bible issue, saying you're forcing your religion on my children, separation of church and state, etc. Um, the courts actually ruled in favor of the school board initially, allowing the Gideons to come back and distribute Bibles. But the court case went on to the Indiana Supreme Court, and it was then overturned, siding with the plaintiffs. So the Gideons could no longer distribute Bibles in our local schools, in our town. So that is the event that prompted my parents to pull my siblings and me out of the public schools to homeschool. So this is kind of where the story gets interesting. In response to all this that was going on in our hometown, small hometown, my mom wrote a letter to the editor of our local newspaper, really small newspaper called the Rensselaer Republican. And her article was titled, "The Absence of the Bible Leads to Moral Decay."
Mm.
And at this time, my parents were new Christians. Maybe 4 or 5 years they've been serving the Lord, Christians, with four young kids, right under the age of 10. So that's where they were. They're about 31, 32 years old, new Christians, trying to raise kids, working hard. So my mom wrote this letter just kind of citing how since the Bibles have been, systematically removed in the 10 Commandments, et cetera, society's woes have really inclined, depression, anxiety, divorce, suicide, murder, all these things are just skyrocketing and they're linked. So she just encouraged people to pray and, pray for the leaders of the country, et cetera. Well, she sent that in. It got published in our little paper. And a few weeks later, my mom got a phone call while my dad was at work from the Maury Povich TV
Oh.
show. If any of you have heard of Maury Povich,
Oh, yeah.
and they were like, "We read your article in the Associated Press out of New York City." And
Wow.
she was like, "Huh? What? How did that happen?" So somehow her article got published in the Associated Press newspaper. A few minutes later, the Phil Donahue show called, inviting my mom and dad onto the show to kind of be a counter argument to Madeline Murray O'Hara, which, if any of you remember her, she was the president of the American Atheists, the most prominent
Okay.
atheist group in America at the time. She was probably the most prominent atheist in America. Um, she was like the main guest on the Phil Donahue show. So my parents prayed about it. And I mean, my dad's an iron worker. My mom's a stay at home mom. They're not activists, they're not involved in local politics. So they're like, what are we going to do? So they prayed and they felt like, okay, here's an opportunity. I think God wants us to go. So they went out to New York, got flown out there. Um, they're getting ready for the show and they're kind of backstage as you are. I remember my dad said he had to use the restroom before they went into the studio. And as he's walking down the hall, Miss O'Hare stepped into the hall at the exact same time. And they had never met each other. And she said to my dad, you're from Rensselaer, aren't you? And he said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And she said, "Those Gideons are slime." She had heard about the court case in Rensselaer, my hometown, about the Gideons. So it was not off to a good start. Anyway, they go into the studio, and it's a largely atheist audience, supporters of Miss O'Hare. And Miss O'Hare during taping is talking about how Christians haven't done much for society. What do they really do anyway? Christians really don't like me, et cetera. They hate me, and just kind of bad mouthing Christians. So my parents were the last ones to speak on the show. And if you've ever seen the Donahue show, people can call in and, they ask questions. Their audience members stand up and hold the mic and they talk. So he introduced my parents. They're sitting front row. And he introduced them and kind of talked about the Gideons. And my dad, even though my mom wrote the letter, my dad was kind of the one who spoke. And he started off, first thing he said is he looked directly at Miss O'Hare and said, Miss O'Hare, I'm a Christian and I don't hate you. In fact, I love you and Jesus Christ loves you. And he basically got to give a gospel message to the whole nation,
Wow.
and just like he pointed to Christ, and he talked about, the separation of church and state. That's not found in our Constitution, but it is found in the founding documents of the USSR. And he just went on a he gave a great message. And it was something obviously I still remember, and it's encouraging to me. But so that's what my parents went through, and kind of a wild experience, but that's what led to us being homeschooled. So you mentioned something at the beginning here. You said why we're doing what we're doing. And that's something that as often as I tell this story about my parents, that's the key message is, I don't remember many projects I did when I was homeschooled, a few, but I always will remember why we were homeschooled,
Yeah.
why we did what we did, why my parents made that decision. So as new Christians, they prioritized the word of God and they wanted to raise their kids, in the fear and admonition of the Lord. They wanted us to have a relationship with Christ. And given what was going on in the local schools, they're removing the Bibles, they're shunning it. That's why they wanted to homeschool us so that they could teach us the word. And so I'll always remember their example that they set.
Yeah.
that the word of God had to be number one. It had to reign supreme. So my encouragement to parents out there, if you're a parent and you're wondering, should, maybe you're in public schools, maybe you're not, you're making the decision, what should I do? Just know that you matter to your children. What you do matters, and why you do what you do matters. They're going to remember the example that you set. So hopefully that's an encouragement to you. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to put pressure on you or a burden, but be encouraged that, what you do matters. So if you take a principle stand on the word of God, it's going to pay dividends for your children. Here I am. This is 30 plus years after the fact, and I'm still remembering learning
Yeah.
lessons. We'll talk about later on, maybe, my experience with Chicago public schools and
Yeah.
the dilemma that I face. But 30 years after my parents' example, I was still remembering and still learning from their example. So parents
Yeah.
matter now more than ever.
Love it. Let's take a break. We'll be right back. We want to thank all of our sponsors for making this show possible: BJU Press Homeschool, CTC Math, Apologia, and IEW. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. Visit the show notes for links to these great companies and thank them for supporting the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. We are back with John Stamper. I love that story of your parents. And I think one of the things that I was thinking through is, we often talk about our why, like, why are we doing this? Why do we homeschool our kids? But I think oftentimes, at least I know for myself, I forget to remind my kids why we do this. And I think it's important for us to talk about that with our kids. Why are we choosing to do this? It's not just for the academics. As a matter of fact, for our family, it's not for the academics at all. Those are an important part of it, but it's more because we want to instill a biblical worldview into their lives and their hearts and their minds, and we want to point them to Jesus. And that's kind of that whole point of your story with your parents. And so I think it's important for us to remember, like, okay, we need to tell our kids, on a semi-regular basis, just remind them, this is why we're doing this. As a matter of fact, it's so interesting with our movie Schoolhouse Rocked. One of the audiences that we did not expect was kids to enjoy the movie. And so we had a lot of people who have responded and said, we watched this as a family and our kids finally understood why we've chosen to homeschool them. And that's been such a great blessing and encouragement to us with the movie. And so thank you for that encouragement. Talk about your time in the public school system. I know that you left your career as a public school teacher in Chicago. Talk through that with us. Why did you leave your career to do that?
Sure. So prior to Chicago, I taught for Chicago public schools from 2020 to 2021, just the one school year, that first full school year of the COVID
Yeah.
shutdown. Prior to that, most of my career had been in Indiana, uh, 1 year in Tennessee. But most of my career, I mean, I love my career. I had been involved in good schools, great principals, colleagues, students, etc. I coached a lot. So I love my career. I was getting better and better. I was becoming a great teacher and coach. But when I married my wife, I was still teaching in Indiana. We were living in Chicago. I was commuting, but we moved further north, and I couldn't do the commute to Indiana. So I looked around and interviewed for jobs in Chicago, and I took a job at a school in Chicago Public Schools. So we started online that school year. We were online remote until March of that school year, so
Wow.
almost the whole year remote. And during the fall of that year, so the fall of 2020, you can kind of take yourself back there.
Yeah.
Most schools were remote, some were opening, but we're struggling with this virtual learning.
Right.
And all the teachers in the school district had to complete mandatory training, which is normal. We do that every year. And it's usually like a new state policy or like, safety protocol, et cetera. Nothing major. You just got to complete it. But this particular training session in the fall, right in the onset of COVID, like we had never been teaching virtually before. So you would think that maybe they're going to give us some strategies on how to manage a virtual classroom, having never done it ever. But no, all of the training slides and materials were about political radical ideologies like critical race theory, intersectionality, gender theory, right? So I was kind of like, this seems a little off base. I had never experienced this in any of my public schools before, right? I kind of heard about it a little bit, but it was always like never witnessed it. So this was kind of my first experience seeing it face to face. And these theories, critical race theory, gender theory, they're being presented to us as fact, right?
Mhm.
This is what we're basing our practices on, our policies. So these are the things that we want you guys to do in the classroom, right? Like it's a fact. So, some of the topics were preferred pronouns, supporting transgender students, intersectionality, right? So some of the policies were always to affirm a transgender student. If a student says, I'm a boy or a girl, it's best practice to affirm them, right? And then so, I mean, as a Christian, I already had a conflict with this because I view this as lying to that child. If a
Right.
child's confused about these things, I can, I'm compassionate about that. I understand confusion is normal, but to knowingly lie, that's not compassionate or loving. And as a Christian, I'm not going to do that. So already there's a conflict between what my employer is asking me to do and what my God is asking me to do. Right.
Right.
So that was kind of the initial conflict. So an example of some of the materials for kindergarten, they asked us to present kindergartners with the gender unicorn. This was to teach students about gender. And it looks like Barney. It's like a purple unicorn. And it says you can be a boy, a girl, or another gender, right? So there are more than two genders. You can be attracted to a boy, a girl, or another gender. So, and that's at kindergarten.
Mm.
And they're saying they're going to love this cute character. Um, so those were the directives from, my school. Uh, Other slides, if you've ever heard of the concept of intersectionality.
Yeah, I've
um,
not heard of that. I was going to ask you what that is.
yeah. So intersectionality it's kind of like a doctrine of critical race theory. So in my book, I discussed this, but what this was, intersectionality, we were given a slide called intersecting identities. And what intersecting identities means is there are two groups. There are privileged groups and marginalized groups. And based on your characteristics, you're in one of these two groups. So uh, the graphic that they presented us, it was two circles. On the outside circle were all the privileged groups, and on the inside circle were all the marginalized groups. And then so the privileged groups were guilty of using tactics of abuse on the marginalized groups. So I'll give you some examples. I'm looking at it right now. I'll give you some examples of the privileged groups that was in my teacher training that all the teachers in Chicago were presented with. So, white people, you're privileged. Boys, men, cisgender people, which means I identify as a man. I was born a man. I'm still a man. I'm cisgender. That's the language. If you're wealthy, if you're a homeowner, if you're middle class, you're privileged. If you're straight, if you're an adult, if you speak English, if you're a Christian, if you don't have a disability, these are all privileged groups. Now, what's really interesting is wherever two of those identities meet, they're intersecting, you have an assigned tactic of abuse. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. If you're a Christian and you have or you're not disabled, you're a healthy body, and you're a Christian, you are also guilty of emotional abuse on non-Christians and people with a disability. So they're just assigning these allegations because I'm a Christian,
Wow.
not based on my behavior or my record, but
Right.
I'm abusive. And then they go on to say, for example, if you're white and you're a man, where those two intersect, you're emotionally abusive toward people of color and girls. Just because I'm a white man, I'm emotionally abusive. And I'm a Christian, I'm emotionally abusive. And this goes on. And this is their training. This is not theory. This is what they're saying is true.
Wow.
And we're going to set our policies based on these facts. So, to put it mildly, this was a big conflict for me. I was not
Sure.
going to implement that or comply with that. So that was kind of the basis of my decision to leave. So my initial response was uh, to file a formal complaint with the school board saying, look, these things that you're putting in these trainings, they are prejudiced, they're discriminatory, they're dividing. What this actually does is it pits classmates against each other, turns
Yeah.
them into enemies.
Right.
Colleagues, turns them into enemies. Here I am in my school, I feel like an enemy in my own school
Right.
based on what my school district is saying about me. So,
Mm.
and so I filed this formal complaint, and basically everything in that complaint is I include in my book. But they did reply. They did reply and say, "We've chosen not to investigate this.
Mhm.
Just not even gonna look into it." Of course, it's against the school board, and So the school board's not going to investigate
Right.
themselves.
Right.
So sorry, see you later. And
Yeah.
that was it. So that's why I was like, they're not even gonna consider this. And then so that is what caused me to resign. I prayed about it.
Mm.
I didn't want to leave my career. I was kind of stuck in a struggle.
Mhm.
I have a serious conflict with these directives that are being given me,
Right.
but this is my career. I worked hard for this. I feel like God has blessed me in this career. I've
Yeah.
learned so much through my career and so many relationships. And I believe God's given me a set of skills, and it's a privilege to be in front of children every day and to be a witness, like a
Yeah.
Christian example to them. So it was a real struggle for me. So to any teachers out there who are going through this, and you're most likely going to experience this if you haven't, it's a real conflict. So the bottom line is, like, you got to be in relationship with God, and
Yeah.
you really got to seek him and communicate with him daily and be in the word and seek his guidance, because my ultimate decision was, and it wasn't an easy decision, was I felt the Lord was asking me to leave and to move on. What kept coming back to me was like Lot leaving the
Mhm.
city before destruction.
Yeah.
I was like, I tried to warn the school board of the wrongs in these trainings. They
Right.
didn't want to hear it. They refused to listen.
Yeah.
They refused to look into it. So I feel like I need to get out of here before destruction comes.
Yeah.
But that's what God was telling me. What he's telling you, maybe he wants you to take a different stand. I don't know. But the point
Yeah.
is, be in relationship with the Lord and communicate with him. Hear for yourself.
I can't imagine how hard
Yep.
that would be. And I really do, I admire you for your willingness to step down and step away. I know that was a really hard decision.
Yep.
And I mean, we're faced with these decisions. It seems like every day, whether it's with our jobs or, we have a situation. We had a situation recently with our girls where there was something, a movie they wanted to watch, and it was a movie that was not acceptable to our family. And we just said, you know what, we're just not going to do this. Like, we have standards for our family, biblical standards that we live by. And even when it seems like the whole world is doing something else, we're going to stand different. We're going to do something different. And several weeks ago, we replayed a message from Miki Addison from our Homegrown Generation Family Expo. It was an online conference that we did. And there we're talking about this very topic of like standing against what the world is telling us to do. And sometimes it's so hard as Christians to do that, but God is worthy. He is worth it. He is worth us standing firm on our convictions. And so I love that you did that. We have so much more to talk about, but we are out of time. So we are going to come back on Wednesday. We're going to talk more about John and his career and what God is doing with him, and just the things that the Lord has shown him through working in the public school system. And we're going to bring some encouragement as well, of course, because that's what we do on the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. So thank you guys so much for being with us. Make sure you stay tuned to the very end of this episode so you can hear a little clip of what's coming next on the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. If you guys have not yet subscribed to our newsletter, go to our website, schoolhouserocked.com, and keep informed of everything we have going on. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you back here on Wednesday. Bye.
Education is discipleship, and this is something I didn't understand until I was probably 3 years into homeschooling. The Bible teaches us in Luke 6:40 that when a student is fully trained, he will be like his teacher. And as we look around the culture right now, I think it begs the question, who is teaching our children? Who is teaching our children, and what are they teaching our children? And to me, the primary benefit of having my children home with me is I am able to impart my worldview to my children.
Marxism itself is an atheist ideology. Karl Marx was quoted by saying, "My objective in life is to dethrone God and destroy capitalism." That was Karl Marx. Lenin removed Bibles from schools, and Mao and the Kim family both portrayed themselves as gods, right? So they corrupt, the biblical model is corrupted. So the Soviet Union, under Lenin, they focused on collectivism and playing your role in society. Lenin tried to politicize education as young as possible. He said that kindergarten classes were the sprouts of communism. That's how important politics were in the young ages of school. Pol Pot in Cambodia rewarded teachers for promoting communism. Anyone who questioned it, they were labeled as traitors or oppressors.